So you're just assuming that your faith is true and mine is false, and you really haven't offered any evidence for that. And secondly, it's very possible that Islam coming after Christianity is actually coming to correct the flaws of Christianity. Even at university, we have textbooks, second edition, third edition, fourth edition. The fourth edition could correct mistakes in the second edition. So maybe the same logic is going on here, Islam correcting Christianity. So I really don't see the relevance of your statement, Dr. White, sorry. The Christian faith came before the Islamic faith.
It is you, Bassam, that assumes that Christianity needs to be corrected. Again, you are completely free to believe what you believe, but you have to do so, again, in complete defiance of all the available historical evidence that Christianity was supposed to be Islam, but got distorted into Christianity. But that burden is completely yours.
Dr. White said there is no evidence that Jesus is a Muslim. I'm not exactly sure what Dr. White, you're a doctor, you deserve to be called a doctor, I'm sorry. Dr. White, it depends on what Dr. White means by evidence. It appears to me that Dr. White is talking about historical evidence in specific. Well, historical evidence is not the only criterion to know truth. I mean, there could be other ways that Muslims can prove Islam to be true. We don't have to necessarily use history to prove Islam is true. There are other ways to prove that Islam is true. Muslims believe that we reasonably have good evidence for our faith. I'm not going to delve into this now.
I surely would like to know what the other methods are, Bassam. I mean, if historical data contradicts your claims, then what other way is there to prove Islam is true? I can't think of any, and if anything, this response of yours is an admission that Islam can't build its case on history as far as its claims of Yeshua goes, which is the point that I've been arguing for the past minutes, and that Dr. White made. If you make a claim and historical data clearly contradicts it, then what other method is there for you, Bassam, to appeal to that Islam is true? For example, if the historical data shows us that Yeshua was a Jew living in 1st century Israel and was practicing Judaism, was a Pharisee who was called Rabbi, then you can't claim that he was a Jew living in Australia practicing Mormonism and making pilgrimage to Mecca and called Imam. Not only is your claim historically bankrupt, but no other argument from any other method would make your claim true. So you are right when you say that historical data is the only way to establish truth, but it is the key factor by which claims can be falsified or be vindicated as far as research goes. And as it stands with Islam, every historical claim that it makes that can be verified is proven to be false. So if historically Yeshua is proven not to practice Islam, then I am extremely curious what method you can come up with to save Islam from its historically flawed claim that he was a Muslim.
And I would like to quote Catherine M. Murphy. She's an associate professor in the Religious Studies Department at Santa Clara University. She said, regarding Jesus' divinity, one of the cardinal principles of historical Jesus research is that the belief in Jesus' divinity is a post-resurrection phenomenon. During his life, his acts of power were understood as signs that God or Satan was working through him, not that he was God.
Well, that is correct. The belief in the divinity of Yeshua is post-resurrection, and it has to be post-resurrection. See, people saw his miracles as an act of either God or Satan, but they often saw his claims about himself as blasphemous. So why would that be? And he was eventually put to death on the charge of blasphemy. Now, why would that be? The charge was blasphemy. Now, anyone can make the claim that Yeshua made, but you would be at risk to be put to death for it. But only one can vindicate you from the charge of blasphemy. That is the God of Israel. And that is exactly what he did by resurrection. And since the resurrection was the vindication of that charge of blasphemy and the proof of the truth of his claims, the faith in his divinity was established with the resurrection. Is that a bad thing? No, it's a logical conclusion. I am glad that the disciples weren't a group of gullible people, which makes the charge of them being so easily persuaded by Paul so unappealing and a far stretch, which brings us to the following point.
The Gospel of John presents Jesus teaching that he's divine, but most scholars treat this as a later interpretation rather than a historical fact because it's so much more highly developed here than in the earliest Gospels and Gospel sources. This is in her book, The Historical Jesus for Dummies, page 178. So it appears that Muslims could possibly appeal to the historical method to prove their case that Jesus really isn't God and that this was a later interpretation, and that he was really only a prophet, and that the miracles that he performed were understood as signs that God was working through him. So I don't believe that all historians, the Western ones that is, would really agree with you. I think they would agree that our concept of Jesus is closer, not exactly, but closer to the truth than yours. I believe there would be a good number of non-Muslim scholars that would state that.
I first heard this charge when listening to Shabir Ali. The charge that the Gospel of John was a result of rolling a snowball. The longer you roll it around, the bigger it gets. Well, this puts people like Shabir in a dilemma. Because how can the snowball theory be true when Paul was supposedly the one who came in and immediately corrupted the teaching that Yeshua was just a prophet? Paul was supposedly the one that made Yeshua God immediately when he joined the disciples. Of course, people like Shabir Ali make the claim despite of the evidence to the contrary, since, for example, Peter calls Yeshua the author of life in Acts 3:15, which you don't say about someone you consider just a prophet. But if Paul came in and made Yeshua God, then why don't we see that in any of the Gospels prior to John, if you're going to hold to the view that Mark presents Yeshua as being smaller than the other Gospel writers? Because by the time Mark writes his Gospel, Paul would have already corrupted the teaching that Jesus was God, right? And to say that historically the Islamic view is stronger than the Christian view of Yeshua is also a stretch. Islam doesn't believe that Yeshua was God's son, while the earliest records clearly say that Yeshua declared himself to be God's son. And the belief that he was God's son is historically very early. Even Peter declared this in Matthew 16. If we are going to take these documents as historical documents, giving us a historical report, then the historical data points again away from the Islamic view of Yeshua and towards the Christian view.
Dr. White talks about how Jesus is identified as the Messiah in several places and quote-unquote sets his face to go to Jerusalem. But that doesn't address my question, Dr. White. My question is, was Jesus willingly offering himself as a sacrifice? To just say sets his face to go to Jerusalem does not prove that he was doing it willingly. It's possible that Jesus was setting his face to Jerusalem unwillingly. So you didn't really address my question. Dr. White refers to Matthew 10, Luke 14, Mark 8, where Jesus told the crowds that they must take up their cross and follow him. And then Dr. White says, and this means that they should follow him to the place of execution. Not all scholars would agree with what Dr. White said.